Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Talking Feds one-on-one. We tape the morning after Donald Trump rolled up a commanding victory in the first primary of 2024, the beginning of an apparent juggernaut that will drive him to the Republican nomination for president. Trump has always seemed to be a bizarre, sui generis figure, and yet we've seen echoes of the Trump phenomenon in other countries, Brexit, for example, or the continuing reactionary turns of Hungary and Turkey. And for us, they frame the question whether there are international bright spots that potentially point away from autocratic rule and toward a full-fledged return to the constitutional rule of law. The last few months have brought such a rare bright spot in Poland, where the relatively autocratic government recently was soundly defeated. We're joined today by really the best person out there to discuss this with us, Pulitzer Prize winning historian and author Anne Applebaum, who's been writing about the struggle between autocracy and democratic rule for years, most recently in The Twilight of Democracy, which we covered on a previous Talking Books, and speaks with special authority about Poland, where she lives and where her partner is foreign minister in the new government. Anne is also senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute, where she co-directs ARENA, a program on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. Anne, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
You described the victory of an opposition coalition, I think of three parties it's now been a few months, over the nationalist Conservative Party Law and Justice as a surprise. Can you elaborate?
Yes, it was a surprise. The former ruling party, which calls itself the Law and Justice Party, had spent the previous 8 years capturing the state, by which I mean they took over the courts, they sought to change their composition, they broke the Constitution in order to do so. They took over state media, which is quite important in Poland, like a lot of European countries. State television is normally a thing that's kind of nonpartisan or bipartisan, is shared, is seen by a lot of people who can't afford private television, especially in Poland. They took over that. They made it into kind of really virulent, angry form of party propaganda. And they also took over state companies, of which there are few in Poland, but they're quite important, and used money from those companies essentially to fund their election campaign. So they ran a campaign in which they had enormous advantages. They controlled a big swath of the media, which actually is publicly owned, taxpayer funded. Their campaign they had 5, 6, 7 times more money than everybody else put together because of money they siphoned off the state in effect. They massaged the rules to make it easier for them to win. It was, for example, very hard to vote in the cities, which is where most of the opposition is, and very easy to vote in the countryside. I actually voted in the countryside in Poland, and we had no waiting line at all. We walked in, voted in 3 minutes. We have friends who waited 3, 4, 5, 6 hours to vote in Warsaw or in Wrocław or Gdańsk. So all those tricks, everything that they could do, they did. They ran a campaign that was focused on kind of messages that the leader of the opposition, Donald Tusk, was not really Polish. He was German. He was a traitor. They talked, they talked up the threat of immigration. They ran a kind of referendum campaign alongside the election in which people were asked, do you want more African and Asian people in our country or not? Something along those lines. And so, every trick that the autocratic world has come up with, and every source of funding, as I said, from the state that they could have, they used. And nevertheless, they lost, which I think was a great surprise.
And handily, yeah. This is really astonishing. It's a parade of horribles that I'm plenty paranoid at this point, but it's in some ways it even eclipses what one thinks Trump could achieve in a second term. So, did they also have control of the did their media control translate into not having a sense until the election results came out that in fact they were going to lose?
Yes, I think they genuinely believed they were winning. And they, polling is terrible in Poland, just like it's terrible
Yeah.
everywhere else. I think their polling was particularly terrible because, people were telling them what they wanted them to hear. But the thing that changed the result was an enormous turnout. So I mean, literally millions of young people, especially young women, many of whom who had never voted before, showed up unexpectedly in large numbers. And
In
so
like the 70% region, yeah.
74%, and that's very high for
Yeah.
Poland. In cities, it was 85%, and I have a friend who voted in a Warsaw district where it was 91%. And so people really voted, and it, in a way, it almost looks like their propaganda campaign, which was really truly vicious. I don't even know how to express it in English. You have to imagine it's as if the farthest fringes of the alt right controlled all the main television networks. And they almost overdid it. So people saw that and they said, we know these people, including Donald Tusk, the leader who's been prime minister before. He's not a devil. He's not a German agent or a Russian spy. And so I think it may have backfired. And then there were two or three issues that really mattered to people. One of them was abortion,
Yeah.
which they had. Poland already had one of the harshest abortion laws in Europe. They made it harsher. They made it very hard for women who had medical conditions to get abortions. And there were a couple of deaths. Women died. They were unable to get abortions, which, by the way, is happening already in the United States.
No. Yeah,
And
for sure.
that
In Texas.
that was
Yeah.
that was a piece of it, and the other piece that's not sui generis, but it's not comparable to the United States. But it was the fear that Poland would be excluded from Europe or wouldn't be part of the
Right.
European Union, would lose its contact to the rest of to the rest of Europe. And I think that was a genuine fear as well. That also motivated people. So there's a kind of combination of things, and the opposition had this is again maybe interesting lesson here for the US. Because there were three parties, there were a series of different messages. So if you were a very progressive left-wing person, you had someone to vote for. If you were a pretty conservative rural person, there was actually an agricultural farmers party that was part of the opposition coalition. You could vote for them. If you were very pro-European, centrist, liberal, there was the main opposition party had that face. So
And did each of them have correlating media out, their own silos, as it were? Because you say everyone went through state media. So where did you get the particular message as the rural leaning right kind of party?
Yeah, so there is other media. There was one other important independent television station, and of course there's social media. I mean, newspapers are fairly weak in Poland, but there are websites, there's local news. But I think social media, and this was also a campaign that was very grassroots and on the ground in a way that hadn't been done in a long time. So Donald Tusk went, round and round the country, and he went to small towns and he went to every city, and lots of other people did that too. So there were enormous number of events and meetings, and there was a lot of thought given by the opposition on how to break through into the sort of ruling party bubble. How can we reach
Yeah.
people there? They and different tactics were tried. People did go on to state media, and they would try and argue their case. People went to the most pro law and justice, most nationalist parts of the country, and campaigned there. So there were a lot of different people who made it work. But it was a surprise. I was surprised.
Wow. Let me ask you this, because with all this power and ruthlessness, law and justice goes in Poland by peace. Yes, that's how people refer to it in shorthand. Not
Yes.
not and unrelated to the American word, but how is it? And I know they lost handily; they got like a third of the vote. But how is it that the voting was all legit? How was it that they hadn't done what one thinks maybe a Trump rule would try to do, which is actually
Heady.
take control of and make and cook the numbers.
So honestly, I thought they would cheat, and they didn't. I think partly because they were so sure they were going to win. Partly because in Poland, it's a small country. We don't have the madness of the U.S. electoral system. It's a small country, and there are the opposition created this, protect the vote, kind of volunteer grassroots groups. There's a system whereby each voting committee has to have by law, representatives of all the parties on it, and people really paid attention to how the vote was counted. And but again, the main reason they didn't cheat was they didn't think they were going to have to. That's my view.
Gotcha.
Everything they could do outside of stealing votes, they did, but they didn't steal votes.
All right. So trying to look at again through the prism of the U.S., I'm not sure where we would say the exact correlating date is, but I think it's useful just to go back to, I think it's 2015 when Peace when is elected
They were
democratically.
elected. They're
So,
democratically
yeah, so
elected.
they came to power. And how did, from that point, the politics devolve into what you've described as pretty close to an autocratic nightmare, just brazen daylight robberies? They come in legit, and what happens?
This wasn't brazen daylight. I mean, they had a very clear plan and a program. They had been in power once before, briefly, and they had lost an election, and they had thought a lot about how to make sure they never lost again. And a lot of what they did is pretty familiar from other times and places. I mean, actually, I have a lecture I've given a few times comparing Poland and Venezuela, and I like that comparison because usually you think of Venezuela being a far left government and the Polish government being a far right government, and they're completely opposite ideologically. They wouldn't agree about anything, but actually the tactics that were used to take over the state had something in common. So one, again, they focused very hard on the courts. Some similarities also to actually what Netanyahu was trying to do in Israel. They
So legal changes, not just hijacking.
legal.
That gave them greater control. Yeah.
Some of it was legal, some of it was unconstitutional. And so there were some things they did that broke the Constitution. I mean, but some things were like, for example, they changed the law so that they created a retirement age for judges. So suddenly, a lot of judges who were over the retirement age had to abruptly leave the court, and that meant they could appoint, dozens of people. So imagine if suddenly a U.S. president came to us and said, "Right, I'm changing the rules, and now all Supreme Court justices over the age of 70 have to retire." Well, then you would get to appoint a lot of Supreme Court justices, right? So it was that kind of thing. It was some similar tactics also in Israel as well,
Right.
but lots of small things that added up to quite a dramatic change. They changed the system by which judges are chosen. And it also created, by the way, a huge legal nightmare, which maybe we'll get onto in a minute, which is you now have legitimate judges and illegitimate judges and enormous amount of kind of double courts and layers of complication that now have to be unpicked. But they did that. They did the takeover of state media, which was also unconstitutional. In Poland's constitution, it says the state media it's public media. It has to be ruled in a bipartisan way. And of course, they changed the rules. And there were several laws they did break. And some of the stuff they did was, has some echoes and would have echoes in the U.S. I mean, for example, civil service. I was going to say civil service reform, but actually civil service destruction. They changed the rules. They changed the qualifications. I mean, so for example, in the foreign ministry, there had been a foreign ministry exam. If you want to be a diplomat, you have to pass it. You have to know 2 languages. They eliminated that so that they could get their people in. And it really became a huge sort of job production campaign, to get their cousins and their friends on the payroll. And they also began to, and this is now coming out now and will come out over the next few months, they also did these, they set up all these fake foundations with vague sounding names, the Republican Foundation or the this foundation, and they put their cousins on the boards of the foundations, and they paid them, so they found ways of distributing money to the party and sort of enriching a new class of people. I mean, and that's the other piece
Yes.
of it that would be very difficult to pick apart.
To unwind. Yeah, there really are parallels. I mean, I see distinctions, but for instance, just in the next week, the Supreme Court's going to hear a couple cases that could go a long way toward dismantling the administrative state, and the three justices that Trump put on will be in favor of it, etc. Is it fair to draw a comparison? I'm sure I'm going to butcher his name, but between Donald Trump, I mean, you implicitly drew one, I think, between is it Mateusz Morawiecki and Chavez? Is it a fair comparison also with Trump himself? Do you see them as analogous leaders in either style or
Yeah,
approach?
I mean, so the real leader of the Peace Party is actually called Kaczynski, called Yaroslav Kaczynski.
Oh, I
Morawiecki was
really did butcher that pronunciation.
yeah,
No, I'm
okay.
just
No,
kidding.
Morawiecki was the prime minister, but he was a
Yeah,
sort of token figure, manipulated by this party leader. And yes, I think there are some comparisons. Kaczynski operates in a very intuitive and emotional manner, and his whole kind of worldview and raison d'etre is all built around conspiracy theories. Big ones, small ones. There's a very important one in Polish history which relates to a plane crash that took place now more than a decade ago that killed the former president of Poland, who happens to have been his twin brother. And he has created a sort of vast apparatus of conspiracy around that plane crash and blames various people for it. And although they were in government for 8 years, they never managed to prove that it was anything except an accident. And in fact, all of the proof, the black boxes, everything that we know about the plane crash is shows that it was an accident based on pilot error and a misreading of it was a crash in a forest. It was a strange place. It was not a normal airport. Anyway, but he operates on conspiracy theories, and he has a kind of magnetic hold over his cult-like supporters. So in that way, you can see some similarities with Trump. I mean, there are other big differences. He's portrays himself as very ascetic. He lives alone with his cat. He doesn't have that vulgar pseudo millionaire thing that Trump has.
yeah.
But some of the tactics of undermining trust in the institutions of the state, use of conspiratorial language, creation of the use of the fear of outsiders and foreigners, the identification of his political opponents as traitors, as betrayers, as foreigners. I mean, literally foreigners. He would call them Germans and Russians. All of that has a lot of echoes in Trump, and also, by the way, in Chavez and Viktor Orban and a number of other democratically elected leaders who have tried to use their democratically elected positions in order to stay in power forever. And I think they believed they would, that they had they were representing the real people, the true Poles, somewhat in a way that Donald Trump talks about real Americans, and that their opponents were, again, liberals, elites, foreigners,
Yeah,
and certainly not the overwhelming majority, which
yeah.
in fact they are.
And Trump has never been, yeah. And as a cohort of supporters, you think of Trump as really being fueled by non-college educated white men, although this is an emerging phenomenon. He did better with college graduates, and that's a whole sort of terrifying subtext. But is there the parallel of the MAGA crowd, demographically, that in his supporters?
So there is a similarity in Poland. The divisions are not so much class divisions, but it's kind of rural, it's kind of provincial cities is a
Yeah,
very important division. And just as in the US, provincial can include wealthier people in the provinces as well as less
Yes.
wealthy people. That identity is more important than almost anything else. And so, yes, they are a party of people who are not, not largely, I should say, because there are a lot of exceptions, but their base is in the countryside. Their base is in eastern Poland, which is historically less well developed and less deeply connected to the rest of Europe.
Less
And
and
they,
less well to do. Yeah. I mean, they
less
take
wealthy,
same as
but
here. Yeah.
it's not just about wealth. It's also Kaczynski was very good at evoking nostalgia, and this also is similar to Trump, and a kind of nostalgia for, or an earlier way, a simpler way of
Great.
life.
Again. Yeah.
The way that we used to be. There's I mean, of course, peculiar in Poland because it's not like there was a moment certainly in the last 100 years when Poland has been great in any sense. They've had a very bad 20th century, but nevertheless, he evoked a sort of, we are losing out, we are losing our young people. They're moving away from the church. The church was part of the story too. They're leaving there. And there was literally, I mean, in this sense, he was hitting something that was real. I mean, there literally has been a kind of migration of the better educated and younger people out of the provinces into the cities and also into the rest of Europe over the last 20 years. And so evoking some kind of nostalgia for past feelings of community was also one of the things that worked very well for Kaczynski and I believe also works for Trump.
Gotcha. And let me contrast it with another nostalgia. You compared this election to the heady days of June 1989. I actually was in Poland then in the
Sure.
exhilaration of Havel Narad and everything. Naharad, is that right? Havel Naharad. And there was a kind of romantic, blessed was in that dawn to be alive kind of feel about it. How does this latest surprise victory compare? Is there the same sort of intoxicating feel or a more, sober, determined kind of second run in power, to be more governmental or professional, as it were? Because it really felt then that everything was being broken and recreated.
So funnily enough, I mean, so there is some of that feeling, and Donald Tusk sought to evoke it in some ways during the campaign. There was a march on June the 4th, which was the anniversary of those elections that you remember in 1989, and so there was some of that feeling. Since then, I mean, the big difference between now and 1990 is that in 1990 the Communist Party knew it had lost and was no longer trying to stay in power and was no longer trying to keep alive its ideology. Whereas Peace and Kaczynski, still don't accept that they've lost, and they are putting brakes. They are attempting to undermine the new government in every way possible. I mean, starting from the moment of the election, Poland is complicated because it has a president as well as a prime minister. The president is actually quite weak. Although he's elected, he doesn't have a huge amount of power, but he has some negative power. And one of his powers is that he
Again,
can,
like Israel. Yeah.
like Israel, like Germany, there are some other countries like that.
Yeah.
And the president delayed the start of the new parliament and effectively delayed the election of the new government for 2 months. I mean, it didn't happen until December. So they've delayed it, and now really at almost every step of the way, they're fighting every single change. I mean, I should say, here's one thing, there is one way in which you can find a relationship to the American political story, which is that the people who are now running Poland, Tusk and people around him, are very conscious of the mistakes made in the United States. So after January the 6th, the Donald Trump was not punished. He was impeached, but then nothing happened. The court cases that investigated him took a long time. They're still running right now. Who knows if they'll even be finished before the election? There weren't any decisive breaks. There wasn't an attempt to stop that movement in its tracks. And the Polish, coalition has this sense that they have a very short time limit. They have to, make some big changes really fast. They have to take back the television. They have to remove the corrupt prosecution service. They have to start the big corruption investigations. They have to do it now, because if they don't do it now, then they'll be facing the same problem down the road. And they're very anxious not to have what we have now in the U.S. 4 years from now, which is a revival of a political movement that we thought was discredited.
Yeah, and I guess one of the possible lessons we can take is what happens if he loses Trump, that is in the U.S., and what will their sort of, it's not obviously not going to go away. I'd love to talk to you for hours about this, but I know you have to go. Can I just ask for kind of final thoughts about the lessons that the U.S. you think can take from the success of the Democratic opposition now as we're heading into 2024?
I mean, I think looking at, thinking hard about all of your constituencies, thinking about, because the coalition that can defeat Trump is a coalition.
Yeah.
It's the left, it's the center, it's maybe, it's a part of the center right. Think broadly about it, and also think about at the same time how to break into those silos. How do you reach people who seem to be inside, unreachable? And think about it. What are the ways to do it? Is it ground campaigning? Is it appearing on Fox? I mean, I'm not going to tell.
I used to do that, and then I stopped. But yeah.
I used to be asked to be on Fox, but they somehow seem to have stopped. But that was quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
Remembering that it's a coalition, remembering that it has to be a broad-based movement that defeats Trump. I think that's a lesson that we can take from Poland.
Anne Applebaum, always illuminating. Thanks so much for your time. Hope to continue to speak with you as the new government develops.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.